B'siyata d'shmaya, we're going to learn Irovin Daf Mem Vov, and we're going to start 5 lines from the top of the Omid. We saw in the Mishnah on Daf Mem He Omid Aleph that Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri maintains, and the Chachomim argued with him, but he maintains that even a sleeping person, if a person is asleep when Shabbos comes in, he can acquire residence as in the context of the halachas of Eirovin, and he gets 2,000 amos around him, even though when Shabbos came in, he was asleep. Says the Gemara, Omer Rav Yaakov bar Idi, Omer Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi. It was said in the name of Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, Halacha Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. The halacha is like Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, that if somebody is sleeping when Shabbos came in, nonetheless he acquires residence and is given 2,000 amos around the place that he was sleeping when Shabbos came in. Omer le Reb Zeira le Rabbi Yaakov bar Idi. Reb Zeira said to Rabbi Yaakov bar Idi, you Rabbi Yaakov bar Idi have said in the name of Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi that the halacha is like Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. But I'm just wondering, asks Reb Zeira, did you actually hear that from Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi explicitly, or is there something else that he said and you deduced from that the halacha is like Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri? And we'll soon see what the difference is going to be. Did you hear it explicitly from Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, or did you just hear something else that he said and you inferred from what he said that that's the halacha? So Rabbi Yaakov bar Idi said to Reb Zeira, I heard him explicitly say that the halacha is like Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. Asks the Gemara, my klola. It seems from Reb Zeira's question that there was something Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi said that one could have deduced from there that the halacha is like Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, even though he didn't say it in that many words, and then Reb Zeira would have come to town on that and questioned that. And that's why Reb Zeira asked Rabbi Yaakov bar Idi whether he actually heard explicitly that Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi said that halacha is like Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. My klola, what do you know that Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi said that you would have deduced from there that halacha is like Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri? Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi said, halacha kedivrei hamekel be'eruv. Whenever you have an argument in the halachas of Eruv, you always follow the lenient opinion. Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi said that. So here in our Mishnah, you have the Chachomim who say that a sleeping person only gets 4 amos. You have Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri who's much more lenient and gives him 2,000 amos on each side. So we would have deduced from there that the halacha is like Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. And that's why Reb Zeira wanted to know, did you just deduce from what Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi said that halacha kedivrei hamekel, from there you understood that halacha is like Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri? Or did you hear him say explicitly that halacha is like Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri? And Rabbi Yaakov bar Idi said, I heard Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi say explicitly that halacha is like Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. Now the question is, if it's clear that Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi said the halacha is always like the lenient opinion in Eirovin, why was it necessary for Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi to explicitly say that the halacha is like Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri? We would have thought, it would seem that it's included and incorporated in his rule that in halachas of Eirovin you always follow the lenient opinion. V'tarati lamali, why do I need 2 statements from Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi where one could be included in the other? Omer Reb Zeira. Reb Zeira explains, Tzrichi, I need them both. Diyesh minon halacha Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. If Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi would just have said that the halacha is just like Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri in our Mishnah, Hava mina, I may have thought, bein lekula, bein lechumra. Because Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri is actually got, besides for it being a leniency for a sleeping person that he gets 2,000 amos in any directions, it's actually a stringency. For example, ownerless objects, according to Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, the objects themselves are koine shvisa, they acquire residence where they are, and they cannot go outside that tchum, 2,000 amos in any direction. However, if we would say that they do not koine shvisa, acquire residence, referring to ownerless objects, then any person that acquires them on Shabbos, those objects now are bound and they have the scope of tchum of the person that acquired them, that made a kinyan in them. So saying that these inanimate, these ownerless objects are actually acquiring residence when Shabbos comes in is a stringency that those objects will no longer, they will not follow the boundaries of the person that is acquiring them on Shabbos. So had Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi just said the halacha is like Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, we may have thought the halacha is also like Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri regarding ownerless objects. That's why he said, Komash Manon, halacha kadivra mekel be'eruv. That's why Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi had to add in that the halacha is always like the more lenient one, and will only rule like Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri as far as the lenient ruling, referring to a sleeping person. But referring to or regarding the ownerless objects, the halacha will not be like Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. They themselves will not acquire residence. Anyone that lifts them up on Shabbos will then be able to move these objects according to their eruv. Says the Gemara, V'leima halacha kedivra mekel be'eruv. So why does it not suffice just to say the halacha is always like the lenient opinion with Eirovin, and you don't need to say the halacha is like Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri? Halacha Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri lomali. Why did you have to add? Why did Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi explicitly have to say that the halacha is like Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri? Says the Gemara Itzrich. I need to say that explicitly. I may have thought Hanamili Yochid b'mokim Yochid. Had Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi just said that the halacha is always like the lenient opinion, I may have thought that that's only true when you've got two individuals arguing with each other. The halacha is like the lenient opinion. V'rabim b'mokim rabim. Or if I have a number of people arguing with a number of people, then also we would say that the halacha is like the more lenient one. Aval yochid b'mokim rabim, when there's an argument with an individual against a number of people, like in the case in our Mishnah, where you've got Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri being an individual and the Chachomim arguing with him being more than one, I may have thought in that case the halacha is not going to be like Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, even though Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri is the more lenient one. And therefore, Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi had to tell us explicitly the halacha is like Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, at least regarding his lenient ruling, even though he's an individual against a number of other chachomim. The same rule applies. The halacha is like the mekel. Says the Gemara, Omale Rava Abaya. Rava said to Abaya, Mechta Eirovin derabonon? Is the halachas of Eirovin that we're discussing here, are they rabbinical halachas? Are they midrabanon? And if they are, assuming that they are, mali yochid b'mokim yochid, mali yochid b'mokim rabim, I wouldn't have entertained the idea to differentiate between if a single person is arguing with another single person or whether he's arguing with the rabbim. It's a derabanon, and you have an in derabbanons, you go after the lenient opinion. So, if so, according to Rava, who says that we would never have entertained an idea of assuming that a yochid v'rabim, the halacha would be like the rabbim, and it would take for granted the halacha will even be like the individual. If so, the question would come back that why did Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi have to say the halacha is like Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri? We would take that for granted. So that was what Rava said to Abaya. And the Gemara is now going to ask a couple of questions against Rava. How can you, Rava, be so sure that just because we're talking about rabbinical halachas, is it so clear and taken for granted that an individual that's arguing with a group of chachomim, the halacha is like the individual? It's true that that's what Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi said, the halacha here was like Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. And we have an issue with that according to Rava. But you, Rava, you're taking it for granted that the halacha would be like the individual. Omalir of popular Rava, ubadrabonon lo yishonilon ben yochid b'mokim yochid leyochid b'mokim rabim. Are you in rabbinical halachas not making any differentiation between an individual arguing with an individual or arguing with a group? Votnan. This seems to contradict an explicit Mishnah. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, kol isha she'ovro leo sholish oinois. Any woman, even if she's a younger woman, if 3 lapses of 30 days have passed and she's not seen any monthly niddah blood, then after 90 days, when she does see blood, then she's only going to be tomei from the moment she saw it. Unlike other times, when a woman sees blood, then we assume that the blood left its source already within the last 24 hours, and therefore any food items that she may have touched in the last 24 hours are now deemed tomei. Rabbi Eliezer says after 90 days, we assume that she's mesulekes, which means we now take it for granted that she's not seeing any more blood. And if she does start seeing blood again, then we assume that this was like something new that started now, and we do not assume that she was already tomei 24 hours before that. And everybody agrees with this if we were talking about an elderly woman. However, here we're talking about even a younger woman. Rabbi Eliezer holds this way. The Chachamim argue and say that even if she hadn't seen blood for 3 months, when she sees blood, the food will be tomei for the 24-hour period before she actually saw the blood. Tanya, we learned in a brisa, Ma'aseh v'osa Rebbe Rabbi Eliezer. The Rebbe ruled like Rabbi Eliezer that a woman that didn't see blood for 90 days and then she saw blood, then he said that only the food that you touch from now is going to become tomei, but the food items you touched in the last 24 hours are not tomei. La'achar shenizkar. At some point, Rebbe remembered. We'll soon see what he remembered, but he realized that ruling was possibly not accurate. Omar, he said, I've already given my ruling. Then since we're dealing here with an emergency, one can rely on Rabbi Eliezer and one does not have to retract the ruling. It was a time of famine and food was scarce, and therefore Rebbe did not want to retract his ruling and say that the food that she touched 24 hours previously was tomei, which would be an issue for many people who would not be able to eat it. And therefore he said, since it's a famine and I've already given the ruling, we can rely on Rebbe Eliezer. So now Rav Papa says, Mai le'achar shenizkar. What did Rebbe remember suddenly after he gave his ruling, that he ruled like Rebbe Eliezer, that made him rethink his ruling, and so to speak, had he realized previously, he would not have ruled like Rebbe Eliezer? Ilema, are you going to suggest? La'achar shenizkar de'ein halacha Rebbe Eliezer elo k'Rabbanon. Could it be that Rebbe suddenly realized the halacha was actually not like Rebbe Eliezer, the halacha was like the Chachamim, and you have to, even the food that she touched 24 hours previously was tomei. If the halacha is clearly like the Rabbanon, then who cares if it's an emergency situation? The halacha is that the food items she touched 24 hours previously, they are tomei. And he should have retracted his halacha and say, I made a mistake, and not relied on Rebbe Eliezer. You don't say that you can Rebbe Eliezer kadai lismei, you can rely on him in time of emergency if it's against the halacha. Elo the truth was there was not a clear ruling whether the halacha is like Rebbe Eliezer and the Chachamim. And la'achar shenizkar delav yochid paligale elo rabim paligale. And what Rebbe realized was that Rebbe Eliezer is actually arguing with more than one person. There was Chachamim in plural that were arguing with Rebbe Eliezer. So Rebbe realized, I should have ruled like the majority, like the Rabbim, not like the Yochid, like the individual. And he said that had I realized initially, I would have ruled like the Rabbim. Now that I've already given the ruling, and it's time of famine, it's an emergency situation, you can keep to the ruling of Rebbe Eliezer, who is an individual. Elo Rabbim pligele. Omar, so he said, Kadei Rebbe Eliezer lismei chalov b'shas hatchak. And what do we see from here? This halacha that food is tomei 24 hours back in time, from the time that she saw blood, because we assume that maybe, possibly, the blood could have actually left its source 24 hours previously, that is a rabbinical precaution. And you see here that even though the issue is a rabbinical one, had Rebbe realized initially, he would not have ruled like Rebbe Eliezer, he would have ruled like the Chachamim. So how can you rather say that with rabbinical halachas, we always go according to the lenient opinion, even if it's an individual, and the fact that even if it's an individual against numerous people, well, you see here clearly that that's not the case. You see that Rebbe would have ruled like the Rabbim had he realized early enough. And this seems to contradict what Rava said. Omar of Masharshia Rava, and now Rav Masharshia is joining Rav Papa to ask another question on Rava. V'omri lo Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak Rava. Others say it was not Rav Masharshia, it was Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak. Ubedarabonon lo yishoni ben yochid b'mokim yochid uben yochid b'mokim rabim. You Rava say that with rabbinical halachas, there's no difference whether the individual is arguing with another individual or a number of people. V'atanya, we learnt in the Brisa, Shmua kroiva noiheges shiva ushloishim. If a person hears that one of his close relatives had passed away, and he hears it called Shmua Kroiva, we'll soon see what that means, but it means a current report. It means something that just happened. Then all the halachas apply. The Noheges Shiva, the 7 days of mourning, and then the 30 days of mourning with all the respective halachas, which we're not going into now, they all apply to this person, which means even though he didn't hear about the death in real time, he may have heard about it a day or two later, nonetheless, he has to sit Shiva and keep the halachas of Shloshim. Rechoika. If, however, the time that the report came to him, it was delayed, it was not immediately, then it's different. Then Ein Heges Elo Yom Echod, he only has to mourn one day. Asks the Brisa of Ezui Kroiva of Ezui Rechoika, how far from the time of the actual death is called an immediate report, and how far is called a delayed report? B'seich shloishim kroiva. If he heard within 30 days of the death, that's called kroiva, and he has to sit shiva and keep shloishim. La'achar shloishim, if he heard after 30 days from the person dying, then that's called rechoika, and he only keeps 1 day of mourning. Divi Rebbe Akiva, that's the opinion of Rebbe Akiva, an individual. The Chachomim say, Achas Shmua Kroiva, V'achas Shmua Rechoika. They are more stringent, and they say that irrespective of whether the news came immediately, which is within 30 days, or it was delayed, which is after 30 days, Noiheges, Shiva, or Shloshim, all the halachas of Shiva and Shloshim apply. That was a machlekes in the Brisa between Rebbe Akiva and the Chachomim. V'omer Rabbi bar Bachana Omer Rabbi Yochanan. It was said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, Kol mokim shata moitze yochid mekel v'rabim machmirim. Whenever you find an individual being lenient and a group, and a rabbim, a plural, a group of people of chachomim who are machmir, they are more stringent. Halacha kedivrei machmirim hamerubim. The halacha is like the many who rule stringently. Chutz mizu, besides for in this case with the halachas of mourning, where the halacha is she'afal pi Rebbe Akiva mekel, even though Rebbe Akiva, the individual, is the lenient one, v'chachomim machmirim, and the many chachomim, they were stringent, nonetheless halacha kediv Rebbe Akiva, the halacha is like the more lenient opinion, like Rebbe Akiva. V'sovar lo and Rabbi Yochanan, who said this holds k'Shmuel, da'amar Shmuel halacha kediv mekel ba'ovil. There's a rule exclusive to the halachas of mourning, that regarding the halachas of mourning, we always follow the more lenient opinion, even if it's just an individual. So what does Rav Masharshia learn from here? Ba'avelas huda akilu be'rabonon. It's only regarding mourning that we follow the individual who is lenient. Aval ba'alma, any other types of halachas and the general rulings not in the area of mourning, Afilu b'derabonon, even though they are rabbinical halachas, and the halachas of mourning are rabbinical halachas, shoni bein yochid b'mokim yochid, bein yochid b'mokim rabim. You see clearly that we do not follow the individual who is lenient if he's being argued upon by a group of people who are being stringent. And this is another question against Rava, who said that with rabbinical halachas, there's no difference between whether the individual is arguing with an individual or with a rabbim. So those were two questions that were posed against Rava. And now the Gemara is going back to the initial, where we started today. Rabbi Shua ben Levi, he said that the halacha was like Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri in our Mishnah, that a sleeping person can acquire residence when Shabbos comes in. And Rabbi Shua ben Levi said the halacha is always like the mekel in the halachas of Eruv. And we said, why do you need both? And Reb Zera explained that I need to say that halacha is like the Mekel in order we shouldn't think that the halacha is like Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri even to be stringent. And I need to say that halacha is like Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri in order that we shouldn't say that halacha is like the majority, like the rabbim, and not like the individual. That's how Reb Zera explained it. Rav Papa Omar, Rav Papa is now going to give another explanation why Rabbi Shua ben Levi said a seemingly the same phrase twice. Once he said the halacha is like the lenient opinion with Eruv, and once he said the halacha was like Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. Why do we need them both? Says Rav Papa, it's true, I need them both. Sol Kodaita Chamina, I may have thought, Hanemile be'eruvei chatzeris. This rule that you always follow the lenient opinion by Eruv, I may have thought it only with Eruvei Chatzeris, when you want all the homeowners of a single yard to be able to carry from their homes into the Chatzah, that's called Eruvei Chatzeris. I would have thought that only there we follow the Mekel, the more lenient opinion. Aval be'eruvei tchumin, but in regarding the Eruv of Tchum, which a person acquires residence to allow him to go 2,000 amos beyond his Eruv on Shabbos, I may have thought there the halachas are more stringent and maybe we will not be more lenient. I may have thought that we are stringent. Tzricha, that's why Rabbi Shua ben Levi had to say that halachas like Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, and Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri is clearly talking about Tchumin. Even there we follow the more lenient opinion. The question is, why should we have thought that there's a difference between Eruvei Chatzeros and Eruvei Tchumin? They both seem to be in the same bracket of the halachas of Eirovin. Why would we differentiate? Says the Gemara, Minor Tamer Deshonilon ben Eruvei Chatzeros le'Eruvei Tchumin. What's the source that we should differentiate between the two different types of Eruv? Ditnan, we learned in a Mishnah. Bameh Omer Yehuda. Bameh Dvorim Amurim. And there the discussion is, do you need a person's prior consent, his das, before making an Eruv for him? If you know that, if you've got a whole group of people who have homes sharing the same courtyard, are you allowed to, on behalf of those homeowners, make an Eruv if they did not consent? They did not tell you to do that. And the same would apply, can you make an Eruv Tchumin for somebody that he did not give you his prior consent? So Rabbi Yehuda said, when do we require prior consent? That's only by Tchum, by Eruv Tchumin. But regarding the Eruv Chatzeros, Ma'arvin, you're allowed to make an Eruv on behalf of somebody else, Bein Ledas, Bein Sheloi Ledas, irrespective of whether he gave you prior consent or not. So you see, and why is that? You're allowed to benefit a person in his absence, and making an Eruvei Chatzeros is always going to be a benefit. It's certainly not going to be a disadvantage to him. He has nothing to lose to make an Eruv, and therefore you can do it even without his consent. However, if what you're doing on behalf of somebody else is a disadvantage to him, it needs to be done in his presence, which means you need his prior consent, because you cannot disadvantage somebody on his back without permission. Making an Eruvei Tchumin it could be a disadvantage, because if a person lives in A, and then if that's where he acquires residence, he can go 4,000 amos anywhere from A. If you make an Eruv Tchumin 2,000 amos, just under 2,000 amos east of A, then that point is the center of his residence, and he can only go 2,000 amos beyond that point B, and from that point on, he can no longer go west from A. So making an Eruv at any point, an Eruvei Tchumin, could be a disadvantage to the person who, had he not made an Eruv Tchumin, would be given 2,000 amos around where he was when Shabbos came in. And since it could be a disadvantage, you can only do it with his consent. But you see clearly here, there's a difference between Eruvei Tchumin and Eruvei Chatzeros. Eruvei Tchumin, you need his consent, Eruvei Chatzeros not. So I may have thought that the halacha that you follow the lenient ruling only applies to Eruvei Chatzeros, not to Eruvei Tchumin. That's why Rabbi Shua ben Levi said, halacha Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, that even regarding Tchumin, we follow the lenient opinion. Rav Ashi Omar, Rav Ashi's got a third explanation why Rabbi Shua ben Levi had to say two phrases. Number one, halacha Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, and number two, the halacha is always like the lenient opinion regarding Eirovin. Itzrach, I need them both. Sol kadaitach amina, I may have thought, hanimili b'shiurei Eirov. These, that I may have thought that when do you follow the lenient opinion, that's only with what we would say the remnants, the remainder, what's left over of an Eirov. If you made an Eirov 1 week, and you put enough food there, or you made an Eirov, and now you want the Eirov to continue being a valid Eirov, there we follow the lenient opinions. However, to initially enact an Eirov and make the Eirov valid, when there's a discussion there, we may have thought that you do not follow the lenient opinion. Aval b'tchila, to make an Eirov initially, b'tchilas Eirov, I may have thought not. That's why you had to say that halacha is like Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri is talking about creating an Eirov. We're talking about a sleeping person, and we want to make an Eirov for him now. It's not as if he had an Eirov. It's not like he put food aside and initially said he wants it to be valid for a number of weeks, and the first week it was valid, and the second week there was a discussion and an argument, and then you would follow the lenient opinion. But we may have thought that when you want to initially make the Eirov valid, then you would follow the more stringent opinion. That's why he said, halacha Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, even in that case, you follow the lenient opinion. Asks the Gemara, where do you get this idea from to differentiate between when an Eirov is already being valid and you want it to continue being valid, and to make an Eirov valid in the first place? Ditnan, we saw such a differentiation in a Mishnah. Omer Rabbi Yosi said, when is it true, in what case is it true that you need a minimum amount of food to put down for an Eirov? An Eirov has to have a minimum amount of food. When do you need that minimum amount of food? We're talking about Eirov Chatzeris. B'tchilas Eirov, when you first want to make an Eirov Chatzeris, you need a certain fixed amount of food, minimum per person, per home. We'll see later on the details. However, if the Eirov was already valid, and now through Shabbos the food slowly got less and less, and now you don't have the minimum required food that you would have needed to make the Eirov, that's now called the Shi'urei Eirov. It's the remainders of the Eirov. Afilu kolshu, even if there's only a minimum amount, or a kolshu, a minute amount of food that's left for the Eirov, a minute amount per house in the Eirov Chatzeris, it's enough. And it's okay. V'lo amru le'eirov Chatzeris, and initially the only reason that we needed a certain fixed minimum amount of food per person was only elo kadei shelo l'shakeach teras Eirov min ha'ktinoikos, in order the children should not forget the halachas of Eirov. That means the main Eirov, Rashi says, is Eirov Tchumen. And there's also a halacha of Eirov Chatzeris. And in order that they shouldn't forget the halachas of Eirov altogether, then the Eirov Chatzeris, they had to have a minimum amount of food per person. But since the only reason that you need that amount of food is in order that the children should not forget the halachas of Eirov, therefore it's only when you actually want to make the Eirov. But once the Eirov was valid and now the food has got less, since intrinsically speaking, it would be enough to have a minimum amount, a minute amount, without a shiur, without a certain measure, minimum measure, just a minute amount per person would have been enough. Therefore, in order to continue the validity of the Eirov, we are more lenient. So you see from here, there's a difference between when you make an Eirov and after the Eirov is already valid. And therefore, said Rav Ashi, we needed Rabbi Shua ben Levi to tell us that the halacha is like Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, even though we're being lenient when we're first making an Eirov for this sleeping person, he's acquiring residence. Even there, the halacha is like the lenient opinion. Continues the Gemara. And now we're discussing a little bit more some rules of how you know, when you have an argument, how you know who to follow. Rabbi Yaakov and Rav Zrika Omru. Rav Yaakov and Rav Zrika both said, Halacha k'Rabbi Akiva mechaveroi. What the word halacha means we'll see in a moment. But the halacha is like Rabbi Akiva v'chaveroi. which means if you have Rabbi Akiva against another colleague of his, when they were arguing, the halacha is like Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Yosi mechaveirov. And Rabbi Yosi, if he's arguing not only with one colleague, but with a number of colleagues, then the halacha is nonetheless like Rabbi Yosi. Ukarebi mechaveiroi. When Rebbe is arguing with a colleague of his, with another chacham, the halacha is like Rebbe. That's what Rabbi Yaakov and Rabbi Zrika said. Asks the Gemara, Lemay Hilchasa, why are you telling us this? And the question here in the Gemara, what the Gemara means to ask, is, are you telling us that these are hardcore rules, which means that these are always the rules, and whenever you have an argument, you rule this way? Or no, is it just that logic would say that you should follow this, but do look into each case separately to see whether in every individual scenario, indeed the halacha follows this rule or not? That was the question. Answers the Gemara. Rav Asi Omar halacha. Reb Chia bar Abba Omar motin. Rabbi Yosi Reb Chanina Omar nirin. And here we have three Amiroim, and they argued when Rabbi Yaakov and Rabbi Zrika said there are some rules, who the halacha is like. What does that mean? Does it mean halacha, which means that it's a rule across the board, and you can even publicize it to everybody and tell them, these are the rules, whenever you have these types of arguments, this is the halacha? That was what Rav Asi said. Reb Chia bar Abba said, motin, which means we're inclined to follow those rules, which means that we're even allowed to rule to a private person, to an individual who comes to ask a question. We can rule following these guidelines. However, do not publicize them. Don't give a drasha in shul and tell everybody that the halacha is Rabbi Akiva v'chaveiroi, or Rabbi Yosi mechaveirov, or Rebbe mechaveiroi. Don't publicize it. But when an individual comes to ask you a question, you're allowed to follow these guidelines. And Rabbi Yosi bar Chanina said, nirin. They appear to be that we have these guidelines, and what he meant is that you shouldn't even rule with these guidelines. They are not halachic guidelines. It just means if you ruled with these guidelines, you do not need to retract your ruling afterwards. That means if Rabbi Akiva mechaveiroi, there's no, according to Rabbi Yosi bar Chanina, there's no reason to believe the halacha is like Rabbi Akiva. If you ruled like Rabbi Akiva, you're allowed to keep to your ruling, because halacha Rabbi Akiva mechaveiroi, nirin, there's some indication in that direction, therefore you do not need to retract your ruling. That's how Rashi explains this Gemara. It was said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, Reb Meir v'Reb Yehuda, halacha Reb Yehuda. When you have an argument between Reb Meir and Reb Yehuda, then Reb Yehuda is always the one who we rule like Reb Yehuda. Reb Yehuda v'Reb Yosi, halacha Reb Yosi. Even though Reb Yehuda is a stronger halachic source than Reb Meir, Reb Yosi is even stronger halachic source than Reb Yehuda. If there's an argument between Reb Meir and Reb Yosi, of course the halacha will be like Reb Yosi. If Reb Meir is, even when he's arguing with Reb Yehuda, then we follow Reb Yehuda, not Reb Meir. Then b'mokim Reb Yosi, if Reb Meir is arguing with Reb Yosi, that Reb Yosi himself is a stronger halachic source than Reb Yehuda is, of course we're going to follow Reb Yosi. B'mokim Reb Yosi miboya. And what we said when the Gemara says Klosh Nazeh, Omer Reb Yaakov, Omer Reb Yochanan, etc., when we just now gave some guidelines in halacha, then the same machlokes we saw before between Reb Asi, Reb Chia bar Abba, and Reb Yosi bar Reb Chanina, that they were discussing what does halacha mean. Does halacha mean that it's an absolute rule and you can even publicize it? Or is it not such an absolute rule, but you can follow those guidelines when somebody asks you? Or is it only that you do not need to retract the halacha if you go that way? Then I think the Gemara means Klosh Nazeh Omer Reb Yaakov Aridi, regarding these rules with Reb Meir, Reb Yehuda and Reb Yosi, the same applies. Omer Rav Asi, Af ani loimed. Till now we were discussing Reb Meir, Reb Yehuda, and Reb Yosi. And now Reb Asi says, Af ani loimed Reb Yosi, v'Reb Shimon halacha Reb Yosi. Not only is Reb Yosi a stronger halachic source than Rabbi Yehuda. Not only is he more than Reb Meir, Rabbi Yehuda himself is more than Reb Meir, but Rabbi Yosi is also more than Reb Shimon. Halachic Rabbi Yosi. The Omer Ba'aba Omer Rabbi Yochanan, because it was said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Yehuda v'Reb Shimon, halachic Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda is a stronger source than Reb Shimon. And we saw before, and hashta b'mokim Rabbi Yehuda leisef Reb Shimon in the place of Rabbi Yehuda, we rule not like Reb Shimon, b'mokim Rabbi Yosi miboya, then of course we do not consider Reb Shimon's opinion if he's arguing with Rabbi Yosi, because Reb Shimon is less than Rabbi Yehuda, and Rabbi Yehuda himself is less than Rabbi Yosi. So obviously, if you have an argument Rabbi Yosi and Rabbi Shimon, the halacha will be like Rabbi Yosi, exactly the same way as if you have a machlokes Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yosi, the halacha will be like Rabbi Yosi. But the Gemara now asks, Rabbi Meir v'Rabbi Shimon mai? Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Shimon, who both have less of a strength in halacha than Rabbi Yehuda, and obviously even less than Rabbi Yosi. But Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Shimon themselves, when they argue, do we have any rules, any guidelines who the halach is? Says the Gemara, Teiku, we have to let that stand. We have no way of resolving that in the Gemara. Continues the Gemara. Omer Reb Mesharshia, and this is the next sugya that's going to take us right into the next daf. Says Reb Mesharshia, Lisnu lahani klola. He says, I do not have any of these rules. All these rules that you just now said, that the halach is, whether the halach is like Rabbi Yosi over Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Yosi over Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Yosi over Rabbi Shimon, I do not have these rules, says Mesharshia, and in every single case, you have to judge it for its own. There's no guidelines. Minole Rabbi Mesharshia. And now the question of the Gemara, the big question is, where does Rabbi Mesharshia, where did he get this idea from that there are no rules? There must be cases where we find clearly that the rulings contradict the guidelines we just saw now. Could it be that it's learned from the following Mishnah? Reb Shimon lemoadov adoyma. Reb Shimon omer lemoadov adoyma lesholish chatzeris apsuchay zu lezu l'rshus upsuchays l'rshus arabim irvu shnayim achitzoynius im emtzoyos imuteres imoan v'hein muteres imo u'shnayim chitzoynius asurais zu im zu. We don't need to go into any great length with this. This was the Mishnah we saw in Daf Mem Hey, that there was a discussion there. If you have three people who are stranded outside a tchum, they each have only 4 amis, but the 4 amis overlap each other. You have A, B, and C. The left hand 2 amis of A overlap the right hand 2 amis of B, and the left hand 2 amis of B overlap the right hand 2 amis of C. And these are 3 people that overlap each other. And we said that A and B have an area where they're overlapping each other. B and C have an area they're overlapping, but A and C have no area they're overlapping, and therefore, even though A and B can eat together in their shared, in the area, the 2 amis that they share, and similarly B and C, but A and C, they have no connection whatsoever, there's no overlapping there. And Reb Shimon said in the Mishnah, this is compared to 3 chatzeros, one next to the other, and in order to be able to carry from one chotzer to the next, or more accurately from a home into somebody else's chotzer, and obviously each chotzer independently has made the Eirovei chatzeros, and neither of the people in one chotzer have any need or right to go into another chotzer, and therefore every chotzer is independent. However, if you want to carry from the things from the homes in one chotzer into a different chotzer, then providing there's a doorway between them, and you've made an Eruv between them, then you can carry. So if the right-hand chotzer made an Eruv with the middle one, and the left-hand chotzer made an Eruv with the middle one, but the right and the left-hand chotzer did not make an Eruv together, then the same applies, says Reb Shimon, to what we saw in our Mishnah, that the things in the homes of the right-hand chotzer can be taken into the middle chotzer. The items in the homes of the left-hand chotzer can be brought to the middle chotzer, but the items in the homes in the right-hand chotzer cannot be taken to the left-hand chotzer. That was the opinion of Reb Shimon. V'omer of Choma bar Guri Omar Rav, was said in the name of Rav, halacha Reb Shimon. The halacha is like Reb Shimon in our Mishnah. And now the Gemara is saying, Uman paligale, who's arguing with Reb Shimon? Rabbi Yehuda, we assume it's Rabbi Yehuda, and there's a discussion why, and Rashi discusses why we should assume it's Rabbi Yehuda, but the Gemara is assuming that the Rabbi Yehuda argues with Reb Shimon. And nonetheless, Rav said the halacha is like Reb Shimon. And this contradicts the rules we just saw now, that when you have a machlokes Rabbi Yehuda and Reb Shimon, the halacha is not like Reb Shimon, the halacha is like Rabbi Yehuda. V'ha'amarta Rabbi Yehuda v'Reb Shimon halacha Rabbi Yehuda. This seems to contradict the rules. So from here, Reb Masharshia learned that these rules do not apply. There are no rules, no guidelines as to how we paskin halacha. Elolav shma minor, listen. From here we can assume, from this Mishnah, from our Mishnah, we assume that these rules were not accepted. Says the Gemara, my kasha. No, it could be that the rules are solid rules, and nonetheless it's not a question from our Mishnah. Dilma, heichad itmar, itmar. If Rav explicitly said the halacha is like Reb Shimon, not like Rabbi Yehuda, so only in those cases the halacha will be like Reb Shimon and not like Rabbi Yehuda. Heichad lo itmar, lo itmar. But whenever there was no explicit ruling saying that the halacha is like Reb Shimon, there we would follow these guidelines and the halacha would be like Rabbi Yehuda. So don't bring a proof from our Mishnah where there's a specific ruling from Rav like Reb Shimon against the general guidelines that we mentioned before. Elo mehadutnan. No, so we've got another Mishnah, and maybe from this Mishnah we'll have proof to Reb Masharshia that the guidelines we mentioned before are not accepted. Because what did we see in the Mishnah? And we're not going to go into all the details because a number of the Mishnayos which the Gemara is going to bring are going to be discussed at length later on in the Masechta. We don't need to get stuck with them here. We saw in the Mishnah, we're going to see in the Mishnah, Iru shel yochid v'nasis shel rabim. If you had a city that had less than 600,000 residents in, and then it grew, and now there are 600,000 residents there, ma'arvin eskula. You are allowed to make an eruv. It would be similar to shitufei muvois, where all the chatzeros, all the streets, you can, obviously providing there's no real rishus harabim. Having 600,000 people there is just one of the conditions, but if the streets are not wide enough, they will not be called Erushus Harabim. But since there are 600,000 people there, nonetheless, one is allowed to make an Eruv in the whole city, and Shitufei Muvois, and then everybody can carry within the city. Shel Rabim v'nasis shel Yochid, if you had a city that had 600,000 people in it, and then the population there went down, and now there are less than 600,000 people there. Now it became, so to speak, shel yochid. Ein ma'arvin eskula. Since it once belonged to a rabbim, then we do not want you now to disregard its past, and people will think that even when there's 600,000 people there, you can always make an eruv, and that's not always so clear, because there's sometimes, if the roads would be wide enough, then it would be Rishus Harabim. Rishus Harabim, you cannot make an Eruv. Either way, if it once was a very large city with 600,000 people in, and then it became less, then Ein Ma'arvin es Kula. You're not allowed to make an Eruv for all the alleyways and streets and courtyards of the city. Elem ken oise chutzelo. You need to leave one area on the outskirts or outside the city which is not included in the Eruv, and then people will know that this was once a city that had 600,000 people in. Elem ken oise le chutzelo keir chadasha. As long as the amount of homes that you leave that are not included in this major Eruv of the whole city is like the town called Chadasha, Shebi Yehuda in Yehuda, Sheyesh bo chamishin durin, where there are 50 inhabitants. If there are 50 inhabitants in that area and they are not included in the main Eruv, then all the rest you can make into an Eruv. Obviously providing that they're not real Rishus Harabims. Divi Rabbi Yehuda, that was the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda. Reb Shimon Omer, Reb Shimon argued with Rabbi Yehuda in that case and said, you don't need to have 50 inhabitants. All you need is shalosh chatzeros shel shnei batim. You need 3 chatzeros where in each of them there were 2 homes, and if these 3 chatzeros with 2 homes in each were not included in the big shitufei muvois of the city, then you can include it you can make an eruv with all the rest. V'omer of Choma bar Guri Amarav, here again Rav came forward and said, halacha Reb Shimon. Even though it's a machlokes Rabbi Yehuda and Reb Shimon, halacha is like Reb Shimon. Uman paligolea, who argues with Reb Shimon? Reb Yehuda. According to the guidelines you mentioned before, the halacha should be like Reb Yehuda, not like Reb Shimon. So is this not a source to Reb Mesharshia that those guidelines were not accepted? Says the Gemara, no, my kashya. It's not a contradiction at all. And the Gemara is for the second time, and not the last time, giving the same answer. Dilma heichad itmar. Here too, when it's explicitly ruled that halacha is like Reb Shimon, not like Reb Yehuda, then those guidelines don't apply. But when no explicit ruling was given, then those guidelines apply. The halacha is going to be like Reb Yehuda and not like Reb Shimon. And in the next year, we're going to continue with the third suggested source for Reb Mesharshia.